Thank you, Lisa. It's good to see everybody again, or not see, as the case may be. I have now been doing these Zoom sessions since COVID started back in March, and I still am not used to not having that audience feedback that you get when you really get to talk to somebody in person. So please feel free to use the chat box to get questions answered. We will review it before we finish the presentation this evening, and I really look forward to making sure that we're trying to get as many questions as answered. I did try to incorporate all of the earlier questions throughout the scope of the presentation, so if I don't get to it right away, just hold off a little bit. I may get to it again before the end, and if not, you'll have an opportunity to re-ask. So I am going to share my screen so that everybody can see PowerPoint that I put together. I'm also going to navigate a little bit away from the PowerPoint so that I can show you how to find some of the guidance documents that the Ohio Department of Education has issued, so that if you have questions or you want to dive deeper than what we're able to cover during this hour or so, you'll have an opportunity to find those resources on your own, reference them, read them, digest them. There's a lot of information and a lot of places to go to look for it. So I will show you how to navigate to some of that information as a part of the presentation. And I know that when we're finished today, Lisa will make available both the recording of the presentation as well as the PowerPoint. So within the PowerPoint, there are links to some of these documents, and you'll be able to link through to those. So that'll be another opportunity to find that information. All right. So I have some general information that I wanted to share, and I think that some people have asked questions about what schools are required to offer. And I think that what we're finding is that right now, there aren't a lot of requirements. There are a lot of recommendations, and schools are really given broad latitude to determine what models of instruction they're going to be offering during this period. We covered a lot of this in session 2, so I'm going to encourage you that if you have a lot of general questions, to go back and look at session 2 again. I know it's still available on the Autism Society of Greater Akron's website. So I would encourage you to go back, give that a listen again, take a look at some of those slides, and there's some more general information. Schools are not required to offer in-person options for students with general education needs. They may be required to provide in-person services to students with special education needs if the special education needs of the student are such that they cannot receive a free appropriate public education via one of their suggested or other offered models. So if your district is going back remote only, and there's a concern about your child receiving FAPE through remote instruction, they may be required to offer some in-person services. We'll talk about that when we get into this a little bit deeper. Are schools required to offer virtual options? Again, they are not required to offer any of those options. If, however, you have a child who has particular susceptibility to infection, if you're in a family that has particular susceptibility to infection, that may be an appropriate accommodation or provision of service to a student with a disability. If a virtual option is available to all students, can a district exclude students with disabilities? The answer to that question is no. If there is a virtual option available for all students, the option also has to be available to students with disabilities. That doesn't necessarily mean, however, that all of the services that would be provided on the IEP will be provided virtually. So we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like, again, as we get into this a little bit deeper. Are there exceptions to the requirement for a school to provide FAPE? No, there are no exceptions via state or federal government to the provision of a free appropriate public education to students with disabilities. Are there any exceptions to timelines? Again, the answer is No. Evaluations and IEPs are to be completed in a timely manner. Services are to be provided. Data is to be collected. Progress reports are supposed to be issued. And those procedural requirements and timelines continue to be in effect. What is the latest concerning masks? We'll go over that when we get a little bit deeper into the conversation. I know that that's been a source of a lot of concern for some people. So we're going to talk about what the current requirements are and whether or not a face shield is another option. Finally, has the Ohio Department of Education issued any guidance concerning the provision of compensatory or recovery services to students with disabilities? Yes, they have. I have included that information in this presentation, as well as links. And what I want to do right now is kind of show you a way to navigate to the link for all of this information through the Ohio Department of Education. So here, I have pulled up the Ohio Department of Education's Reset and Restart Education Planning website. If you go just Google Ohio Department of Education, you'll
Kerry,
get to their
you can't
home.
see it on your screen. It's not showing.
Oh, huh.
It's still on the PowerPoint.
Gotcha. Let me stop share and
Yeah.
then reshare. Thank you. Here it is. There we go. Now you should see it. Lisa, can you see it now?
Yes, I can see it now.
All right, thank you. So if you Google Ohio Department of Education, you'll get to their homepage, and there's a link right off their homepage to the Reset and Restart. You can also Google Ohio Department of Education Restart, and you'll get a link right to this page. What's nice about this page is that it includes all of the Ohio Department of Education guidance that we're going to talk about today. So all of the links to any of the information that I'm going to talk about will be on this page through the Ohio Department of Education. And you'll see at the very top of the page is the general planning guide that's right over here. And then as you go down, you're going to see specific resources for subsets of students. And so we're going to talk today about a couple of these. We're going to talk a little bit about early education, so you can click through that link and get all of the early education or preschool guidance. We're also going to talk a little bit today about planning for blended or remote learning. And we're going to talk the most today about students with disabilities and some of the additional considerations that are outlined in this particular guidance document. So this is your resource for all things COVID-19 and the Ohio Department of Education. You can also link through the planning guide to get to the Ohio Department of Health requirements for things like sanitizing, social distancing. I think they have links to the mask requirements. So all of that will be provided there as well. So I'm going to stop share again and go back to, sorry about that. Go back to sharing the PowerPoint. All right. All right. I also included, so that you'll have it, the individual links down here. So when you get a copy of the presentation, you'll be able to link through from the document. All right. I'm going to start with updated guidance for in-school services. I know that we have students and families that are joining us from all over the area, and not every district has made the same decision about starting in-person services. So I'm located in Cuyahoga County. Most of the schools in Cuyahoga County have followed the recommendation from the Cuyahoga County Board of Health to start services in remote only. I know that Summit County issued a recommendation. Some schools in Summit County are following that recommendation. Some are not. It was a Gentler recommendation from Summit County. I know that many schools in Franklin County, so in our population centers, we're seeing that more schools are starting in remote learning than what we're seeing in some of our less populated areas. So some of our more rural areas are starting more in-school services. So I just wanted to provide a few updates in this area. What has changed? Not much. Since session 2, there really have not been a lot of changes about guidance to provide services in school. What we're finding is that the social distancing recommendation has really been solidified from 3 feet to a solid 6 feet. They really don't want students in proximity closer than about 6 feet. If students are going to be in closer proximity than 6 feet, they're recommending the use of plastic dividers that are easily cleaned so that the spread or transmission is not as easy to accomplish. Preschool kids and kids with developmental needs, I think, is where schools are struggling the most. I think that we recognize that the developmental needs of those kids are such that maintaining social distancing and following a lot of these procedures are going to be more challenging than what we're seeing with our other older kids. And so I would encourage you, if you're talking about or working with a preschool student, I'm going to encourage you to read the Early Learning and School Readiness Guide. Basically, the recommendations within that guide are a little softer. They recognize that kids are going to need more hand-on-hand support. They're going to need more teacher proximity, and teachers are allowed to provide that support. The concern that a lot of families and teachers have about that proximity is then, of course, the transmission of COVID-19. Schools are balancing that concern in very different ways. And so for me to, in kind of a global presentation, talk to you about what individual school districts are doing, it would be very difficult. That's why I'm encouraging you to read these recommendations. The early learning and school readiness recommendations have been around for a little over a month, I believe. So that information should be well known to your school district. I think some school districts have held off making a decision about some of the more vulnerable kids and populations that we see. But I'm going to encourage you to go that route. Masks. I'll talk specifically about masks in the next slide. Some other things that we want to make sure as we're considering in-school services, the delivery of instructional services as listed on the IEP should be provided as written. So when you have a student who is going to be in school in person, those services need to be provided as written. I'm going to skip down to the bottom bullet, and the conversation is, well, what about hybrid models? And a hybrid model is where the student is in school for a period of time, maybe 1 or 2 days a week, and then out of school for the remainder of the week, or they're shifting and they're going to school 1 week and not the next. Again, every district is doing something a little different. But in a hybrid model, again, IEP services are supposed to be provided as written in the IEP. I think your conversation, if you're going to be in hybrid, if your child is in school, is what does that look like for students that are going to be at home? It's my understanding that a lot of school districts in the hybrid model are intending to provide instruction during in-person days, and then establishing a lot of independent work to be done at home during at-home days. And that can be problematic for students with disabilities that don't have the ability to self-pace or to manage from an executive functioning perspective a lot of information, or for students that need a great deal of prompting or support in completing independent work. So I think we have to be asking questions in our IEP team meetings about what kind of supports are needed during those at-home days. I also am having some districts that are doing some creative things in terms of maximizing the in-person days. So they're really looking at what subjects do kids need to be learning in person. Can we do math and reading in person and then focus on other less intensive need courses like science or social studies to be delivered on at-home days. So we're seeing some different things from different districts. And again, in this kind of setting, it's hard for me to tell you what to look for. But when you're looking into having your IEPT meeting or talking to your team about what services look like for your child when they're in school and then when they're out of school, these are some of the questions to be asking about in-school or hybrid model delivery of services. Other considerations include transportation. I would be asking, how is transportation going to be provided? Again, unless transportation is a service on the IEP, some students, if your district is altering their transportation plans, may not be getting transportation, so you're going to want to solidify that as a part of your IEP. Preschool students. I actually had a question as I was preparing for today for preschool students, and the question was, my district is only offering in-person preschool services. And this family had a particular concern about their child being in in-person services. What other options may be available? I would talk to the team about the availability of itinerant services. Itinerant services have been provided as part of the preschool model for quite some time. And itinerant services tend to be services that are provided not in a center-based setting, but on kind of an as-needed basis. And it may be that you can do an itinerant service model that wouldn't require daily or regular attendance in a center-based model and may limit exposure more and still have access to things like speech, OT, and PT. So it's something to consider. Remote learning for students that are in a preschool setting is particularly challenging. I would not want to be a preschool teacher right now trying to figure out how to deliver services to students who can't necessarily read to navigate a screen. It's going to require a lot of support from families, and I know sometimes that's not possible during working hours. So I think we all are going to need to meet our families and our kids kind of where they are and work through these decisions on a little bit of an individual level. So again, for preschool students, you've got a significant challenge. And I would just encourage you to schedule an IEP meeting and start working through some of these really difficult questions. Considerations also need to be made for students that are going to be back to school about what kids need compensatory or recovery services. And before we close today, I'm going to talk to you about how to make that determination, what kind of assessments to do. So we'll get to that later. The concept of compensatory or recovery services is that students with disabilities missed a lot of instruction during COVID-related closures last March through the end of the school year. Some districts did a better job at providing IEP services than others, and some students were able to maintain progress on their goals and objectives better than others. So when we get to that conversation, it's something to keep in mind about whether or not you feel like your child was able to sustain their progress during that period of closure, or whether we need some services now to return them to the position that they would be in had the COVID closures not occurred. And so we'll talk about that before we close. All right, updated mask rules. So just this weekend, the governor came out with additional guidance and an update to the rules requiring masks. The rule is that all students, teachers, and staff, when inside a school building or on transportation, are required to wear masks. They are also required if the student is outside or waiting for a bus if students are not able to maintain 6-foot social distancing when outside. There are some limited exceptions. The limited exceptions include an individual that has a medical condition, such as a respiratory condition that restricts breathing, a mental health condition, or a disability that is worsened by wearing a mask. And we didn't really get a lot of guidance about what that means. So I looked at the earlier Ohio Children's Hospital Association guidance for some of the exemptions that they had outlined. So those exemptions include children under the age of 2. So again, we're not very clear about what happens with kids that are in preschool. Right now, it's a K through 12 order. My guess, though, is that in light of the Ohio Children's Hospital Association guidance, that they are going to encourage students in preschool to wear masks. Any child unable to remove the covering without assistance. So if a person cannot remove their face covering without help, if they can't take it off, then they would not be required to wear one. Any child with significant behavioral or psychological issues that are undergoing treatment that would be exacerbated by the use of facial coverings, including things like severe anxiety or sensory tactile aversions. Students with severe autism or with extreme developmental delay. And those are not my words, those are the words that are in the guidance documents that we've seen. Severe autism or extreme developmental delay who may become agitated or anxious wearing a mask, or a child with a facial deformity that causes an airway obstruction. So those are the exemptions, and you can see that they're very limited in scope. And so I am telling clients, I'm telling schools, the exemptions for kids to wear masks are very limited. Some additional exemptions: an individual communicating with someone who is hearing impaired, an individual participating in outdoor activities where they can maintain distance, they'll be able to take the mask off then. Someone who is sitting and eating and drinking. So you'll notice this is two things. You have to be sitting and eating or drinking in order to take it off, not just sitting, and not just eating and drinking. So both of those things together. During lessons where student and staff are 6 feet apart and wearing a face mask would prevent instruction or participation in a lesson. So I think this would be applicable to like a speech session, particularly if you're working on articulation, foreign language classes, a student with a hearing impairment that would need to read lips. Then the instructor would want to look at something alternative. Anytime students are at least 6 feet apart and a teacher deems a mask break necessary. So teachers will be able to build into their classrooms mask breaks. That has been left to the discretion of the teacher and the principal, and at least by the governor's orders, and so that will be an opportunity for kids to kind of get a break. When an individual is alone in an enclosed space like an office, I am in my office right now, there's nobody else here, so I do not have a mask on. Or where there is an established religious requirement that exists that does not allow wearing a mask. And so I don't have a lot of knowledge about what established religions include not allowing a mask, but I certainly would respect it if there was an exemption, that we would honor that exemption. So there was a big question, what about face shields? I know a lot of us have relied on the use of a face shield for students that are particularly tactile defensive, or that are having a hard time wearing a mask. A face shield is not compliant with the order. That was a very specific statement. It is better than nothing, though. And so what I would say to you is that if you have an individual who falls under one of the exemptions, so they're not required to wear a mask, then a face shield can be a substitute that would be appropriate. But you can't use a mask shield if you, or I'm sorry, a face shield if you are not otherwise exempt. Can a child be forced to go online, or can a parent be forced to transport the child to school if the child can't or won't wear a mask? I don't know. There are some, I wish that I could tell you that there was this blanket rule that would apply to all of you. And I can't. In this particular situation, this is going to be a very factually intensive kind of answer. It's going to depend on whether or not a reasonable accommodation can be made within the classroom setting for the child and the people around the child to still be safe. And it's going to depend on whether or not there is a lot of spread in the community such that there's a dangerousness factor to the risk of infection. So I wish that I could tell you that there was a one-stop shop answer to that question, but there's not. It may be that some students, if we cannot otherwise protect the health or safety of others, may need to be educated in an environment that is not in the school building. And so again, that's going to be a very fact-specific inquiry. There's not going to be able to be a blanket decision either for or against a student who can't wear a mask being in school. So this is where I'm getting most of my questions. What about districts that are starting online or remote? Again, general information about those models are available in session 2. I encourage you to go back and take a look at those. Some IEP service delivery considerations that I think we really need to focus on include delivery of services as written. So again, IEPs, even if the district is opening in a remote learning plan, are supposed to be delivered as written. So what that might mean is that we're going to be talking about what does it look like to deliver services in an inclusion environment if kids are online? What is a resource environment going to look like online? What is tutoring, individual and small group, going to look like online? How are we going to be doing related services? How are districts going to be providing IEP accommodations and modifications online? So those are some of the service delivery considerations that we're looking at when we're talking about a remote learning environment. Districts will have to provide tech devices, internet services, and tech support to students that otherwise don't have them. So they're not required to provide one-on-one devices and internet access if students have them available. But if a student does not have those devices available and the district goes to remote learning, those would have to be provided. I had an interesting question that I thought was problematic, and so I wanted to address it here. Someone had asked what to do if the virtual learning vendor that the district had selected did not include services for students with disabilities. You need to convene an IEP team meeting right away. And I say that because IEP services may still need to be provided by the school district via either online conferencing or in-person services. And you're going to have to figure out how those services are going to be provided. You'll also have to figure out how how IEP accommodations and modifications will be provided if the vendor of the service does not already have those things built into the online learning platform. And so there are a lot of considerations that will need to be discussed. I also wanted to make a note because a couple of people have asked me, if my child has to stay home because of COVID-related infection concerns, does the district have to send a teacher to my house? I would say to you that that is very unlikely. There might be 1 or 2 scenarios that I can conceive of where a child, in order to benefit from instruction, would have to receive services at home because of their susceptibility to infection. But that's going to be a really high marker. Home instruction services are very limited in scope and in the least restrictive environment. So kids don't stay home and receive home services typically as a part of their educational profile. And I get that there is nothing typical about COVID-19. But I don't want to kind of give you a lot of information that would lead you to think that if my child is home with remote learning, that I'm somehow entitled to have a teacher come to the house. So those are going to be a couple, that's going to be a very difficult, again, very personal case-by-case kind of analysis. If, however, you are engaged in remote learning and there's a remote learning plan or an online option that has been offered to families in your district, that option has to be available to all kids. And the district is going to have to come up with a way to have reasonable accommodations, modifications to policies or procedures, and a way for your child with a disability to access that platform and to benefit from it. So there are a couple of different laws that we have to analyze when we're making some of these statements. And one is the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504 of the Rehab Act. And then the other is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So there's the intersection of a lot of different thoughts and ideas and requirements that go into answering some of these questions. I'm trying to give you as much general information as I can, while also saying that there are very specific circumstances in which some of these things might be appropriate. But I can't tell you that from a global perspective that they're going to be required or needed by all students. And so I'm trying to walk kind of a fine line between saying that might be a little bit more than what is typically required. So I hope that you guys are kind of understanding where I'm coming from with some of this. And at-home instruction is something that I think is going to be exceptional, not typical. Data collection practices for kids that are in remote learning. The district has the obligation to provide district personnel to collect data. That's very clear in Ohio Department of Education guidance. I know during COVID closures back in March, some parents got checklists that they were supposed to fill out or observational data that they were supposed to provide to the school. That is not appropriate under guidance moving forward. So what about delivery of special education and related services? Every district is doing this a little bit differently. Some school districts are providing in-person special ed services via remote access, so like a Zoom session like this. And some school districts are providing services through an online product. So it's hard for me, again, to give you kind of a very clear guidance on that, because some of it depends on what your individual district is doing. But what I can tell you is that your IEP should reflect service delivery and least restrictive options across all potential service delivery models. So what that means is that your IEP should indicate, if you are going to be remote, what are services going to look like if you're remote? If you're going to be hybrid, what are your services supposed to look like if they're hybrid? And if you're going to be all in, what are the services going to look like if you're all in? Now, obviously, if you're a parent that has chosen one of those models or another, your IEP team can really focus on the model that you've chosen. For most parents, though, at this point, there is this ever shifting attendance from in-person to hybrid to remote. What that looks like may be different in all three of those scenarios. And I think it's really time for our IEP teams to hammer down what those services are going to look like. I know a lot of kids that are scheduled to go back to school next week, and parents have no idea what their IEP services are going to look like, whether remote or in person. So again, I'm going to encourage you, there's a little bit of flexibility here, but not a lot. And schools are required to provide a free, appropriate public education on day one. And I know that this has been ever shifting. I know that this is a challenge like schools have never faced before. But I also know that there's been a lot of patience on the part of parents for the last 6 months in trying to give people time and grace to figure this out. And so I do think that as schools are starting back up again, it is time to schedule these meetings, start having conversations with your IEP team, nail down what those services are going to look like, and start to press for specifics on all of these issues. Advocating for in-person services during remote learning. This is absolutely the number one set of questions that I received. And so what I put in this slide here is that the Ohio Department of Education, in their guidance document, really glosses over this. So I am not going to be a popular person with the Ohio Department of Education or a lot of school districts right now, so I apologize if that's the hat that you're wearing kind of coming to the presentation. I'm not saying this in an intended, in a way to try to circumvent what is required. What I am telling parents, though, ODE's guidance is that everybody needs to be flexible. And that were great if all of our kids were flexible. Many of our kids are not flexible. and many of their learning styles are not flexible. And so we have to meet our kids where they are. The Ohio Department of Education guidance says that schools need to consider alternative delivery models to safely meet the needs of students who receive special education services. And that districts need to, and I'm putting this in quotes, make a good faith effort to determine how a free, appropriate public education will be provided. There is no definition of what a good faith effort means, and I would suggest to you that the federal law requires more than an attempt to provide faith. Federal law requires a plan reasonably proposed, reasonably tailored to provide a free, appropriate public education in light of the circumstances of the child. So I would encourage you all to focus on what the law requires, and that is an IEP that is reasonably calculated to provide appropriate services and progress to a child in light of their individual circumstances. What the Ohio Department of Education has said constitutes a good faith effort is that students with disabilities have access to devices and connectivity, that the IEP team looks at what assistance, resources, and supports are needed for the child to participate in the online learning model. I think that key bullet point right there is a little more problematic than anyone is giving it credit for. Many of my clients have struggled to access the online learning platform, organize the online learning platform, attend to instruction in an online learning platform, complete work online without the access to physical manipulatives, without access to additional supports. So, I'm kind of challenging and pushing this a little bit. Can a remote model support the free, appropriate public education a child needs and the delivery of specially designed instruction? Absolutely, it can. There are many students with disabilities who have no problem with online learning. I have some kids that have excelled with online learning. The model makes sense to them. They enjoy the interaction. They enjoy some anonymity sometimes. There's not a lot of social pressures. But I think we really need to look at what does that mean for each individual student. And in order to make that decision, we have to dig into the actual goals and objectives and instructional targets that are in the IEP. So can the IEP be implemented solely through remote learning? And I put this in quotes because this is in the guidance document, regardless of where the learning is happening, the supports and services must be in place to the extent practicable without putting the health and safety of students and staff at risk. Many students and many schools are interpreting that to mean that we put safety first. And the Ohio Department of Education has said we put safety first. And I think we all recognize that we need to put safety first. However, the Cuyahoga and Federal County Boards of Health have both said that 1-to-9 ratio and small group instruction is appropriate when a student's educational need necessitates that services are delivered in person. So a blanket decision by a district to not offer any in-person services, I think, is a unilateral decision, not one that is necessarily appropriate for all students. And that's why your individual IEP team meetings are going to be so critically important. So I think that, again, if your child needs support to participate in the remote learning platform, that's a conversation for the IEP team. If they need instruction in person in order to make progress on IEP goals and objectives, that's a conversation for your IEP team. And that's really where the push should be. Is training needed for proper use of the online platform? I have some students that need to learn how to navigate it. They can participate in the online instruction, but they don't know how to submit assignments. They can't keep track of anything. That would be kind of a different level of training that would be required. We also have considerations of least restrictive environment. So if you take a look at your IEP and your child's educational services are being provided in a gen ed setting, and typically that's done through a co-taught environment where a special ed teacher is participating in the instruction in the classroom, then we would want to make sure that was also replicated in a remote learning environment. So is the special education teacher available to make accommodations, to make modifications to the curriculum if appropriate, and to provide the supports in the instructional model remote learning the same way they would be if it was in-person learning. And a lot of schools are trying to do scheduling that would enable that to happen. One area where we're finding some questions or concerns is when a family elects to do remote learning while the IEP team has said, we really think your child needs to be in person in order to access services and FAPE. That's a legitimate concern, and I think one that IEP teams need to work through. So the Ohio Department of Education guidance has said that if that's a situation that has occurred, has the team discussed alternative options? So has everybody discussed ways to do some in-person services or to do some maybe in-person via Zoom kind of services if that's not what the remote learning platform that the district has purchased provides? Have we really considered all the options before making a decision that that's not appropriate for a child? And so we need to kind of walk through a variety of different things. I want to make a special note that it's my understanding that there are some schools that are asking parents to sign waivers if they are electing remote learning. And the IEP team has said that they need in-person instruction. I have had people ask me, should I sign it? And again, this is one of those situations where I can't advise you in this kind of situation what you should or should not do individually. I can tell you that I have significant concerns about a parent of a child with a disability signing a waiver of any kind without getting some kind of legal advice about what it is you're waiving, how that impacts your child's right to receive services, and what that's going to look like on the back end if your child regresses or doesn't make progress. So I would encourage you that if you are in that situation, that you should seek out some very specific consultation before you submit a waiver that you've signed and said that you understand that the district may not be providing the services that your child needs. So I can't give you any more specific advice than that because I don't know your child and I don't know the waiver language and I don't know this specific situation about why you went online or what the district is proposing. And those are all things that we would have to weigh in before giving you legal advice about signing a waiver. So I apologize that I can't be a little bit more focused, but I wouldn't want to give you inappropriate information either. Okay, one thing that I underlined and that I think is really important is that the Ohio Department of Education has said that when a school is in remote learning, that all special education services must be provided during remote or blended learning, and they must be individualized. And that data must be collected by school staff and teachers. So again, we really need to look at during the remote learning environment, how are co-taught classes going to be done? How are resource room services going to be provided? How are they going to be staffed? How will social, emotional, and behavioral supports be provided? What about aid and paraprofessional services that your child may otherwise be receiving? How are those going to be provided? How are we going to do related services? And some related services are easier to provide via remote learning than others. Obviously, hands-on related services, PT, some OT have been very difficult to do through telehealth. So in-person services for those would be appropriate. And I think you need to talk to your IEP team about doing that. Therapy centers are open. They've been providing in-person services now since June. They're doing it safely. And I would suggest that school districts can also provide these services safely. They need to put in place the safety protocols that the Ohio Department of Education outlines and that the Ohio Department of Health requires in terms of face masks and social distancing and sanitization protocols, and but there really is no reason that if a child needs in-person services, that those boards of health recommendations can't be followed in a way that would enable a child to receive them. So what about compensatory and recovery services? There has been a question all along. I just got a sign that my internet connection is unstable, so I hope that works its way through. There has been a question all along since COVID closures occurred about what are we going to do with some of our students that may have regressed. And so the Ohio Department of Education has put together in its guidance document information about compensatory and recovery services. So I want to draw a distinction between these two because the Ohio Department of Education has drawn a distinction between these two things. Compensatory education services are services that a student should have received but did not during the closure, while other students were getting services. So again, if other kids were getting their services, and many of our gen ed kids were getting some gen ed services, and the special ed kids did not get their special ed services, then that would be a request for compensatory education services. If your child got services but didn't make as much progress as expected, or otherwise displayed some gaps in their learning because they didn't respond well to remote learning, because services were limited for whatever reason, they may require additional services and supports to resume learning based on their current levels of performance. And so when we're talking about recovery services, it's a nice way of saying compensatory services. Either way, the goal of the services is to return the child to the place that they would be today, but for that delay in providing services or the situation that occurred where they didn't get the services that they otherwise needed in order to make the progress that everybody thought that they should make. So, considerations in determining whether or not recovery services are needed. I mean, number one, does the child need it, right? Like, not all of our kids have regressed during this period of time. Not all of our kids have lost skills. Not all of our kids failed to make progress. Some did very well. So really, this is a conversation for people that are concerned that their child did not make the progress that they thought they should have made. We're looking at, what was the student's performance level at the time of the closure? Had they made progress on their IEP goals and objectives? Take a look at goals, objectives, and benchmarks and the progress data that your child had. Look at the assessments in the child's records. Did you have MAP assessments or STAR assessments or AIMS-Web or any of those other short cycle assessments or benchmarking assessments that schools give in order to determine student progress? Review all of that. Look at what services were provided during the closure and the data and documentation of progress that you may have from that time period. I recognize that data and documentation from that time period is extraordinarily limited. And then we want to take a look at where is our child coming into this school year. And so that initial process of baselining services, where is your child when they come back into getting services this year? And that's a question that we need to ask, whether we are in-person services or whether we are doing remote learning. And we need to ask our IEP teams, how are you going to assess my child's present levels today? And so I would ask the question, can we do new baseline assessments using some of the district-based cycle assessments that you normally give? Can we go back in and do new goal data? Can we take new data on goals and objectives and see where the child is today? Or have we gotten to the point where we really need to do a full reevaluation? Like, are things slipping in a number of different areas? Do we have significant or serious concerns about regression, such that we need a full evaluation? And I think, again, this is a conversation for your IEP team. Then the team should talk about how are we going to collect that data? What kind of timeline are we looking at? What procedures do we need to go through? I would suggest to you that if what you're talking about is just collecting new baseline data for goals and objectives and doing some short cycle assessments like MapStar, AimsWeb, that those short cycle assessments and data can be done within 2 to 4 weeks. It should not extend 9 weeks into the school year. We shouldn't wait to reestablish baselines. Baselines are where a child is today. I also am concerned about waiting for an extended period of time because we don't know what other circumstances are going to come up. And so we need some data. We probably don't have good data for a period of time, and we need to figure out how we're going to get it so that we're not losing any more instructional opportunity. So once you decide how you're going to assess those levels, if that data comes back and there has been evidence that a child is not where you expect a child to be at this point in the IEP. So again, if your IEP, if you should have mastered a bunch of goals by October and suddenly you're no further along than you were when you left in January, or I'm sorry, in March, it's unlikely that you're going to master all of those goals within a month. So we need to look at what kind of services would be necessary, what type of services, and then put together a plan to provide those recovery services. Within the IEP guidance, there's a lot of questions and not a lot of answers about what this will look like. What ODE says is districts should document on the IEP any decisions made about recovery services and what they should look like. I would suggest to you that you do not agree to remove goals off of an IEP because they're not going to be mastered. The goals that are on the IEP now should be there, they should stay. If the child is not able to attain those goals because of regression, then we need to add some new goals. We need to identify why they're added and why they're there. But if the team's decision was that the child was capable of reaching these initial goals within a certain time frame, that should still be the goal for the IEP. So again, there are more questions than answers, but I wanted to outline the questions that you should be going through with your team so that you know how to handle this conversation when it comes up. Are we going to do additional services, or are we going to intensify the services that are already on the IEP? So for example, if your child has regressed in the area of reading and they were receiving 60 minutes of service per week, are we looking at doing 120 minutes of that service per week instead of 60? So are we intensifying the existing instruction? Or do we need to actually put some additional instruction outside of the school day that would support what's happening during the school day? And the one thing that I do want to make a notation of is that recovery services are not helpful if students are missing other instruction for the purposes of recovery. So we don't want kids missing instruction in order to get recovery services, because then you're going to create a situation where they need recovery services because of the recovery services. So just be very cautious and careful as to how those things are going to be structured, where in the day you can really do intervention so that it's not interrupting other instruction. And I know a lot of our kids are already pretty packed during the day. So we may need to be looking at services provided outside of the school day in order to make that happen. And we also don't, recovery services can happen over the course of time. They don't have to occur all today. We don't expect that our kids are going to recoup everything that they may have lost over the course of the last 5 to 6 months. So they can take some time, and we can look at providing those services over the course of the school year, during breaks, and even into next summer. A few final questions before I turn this over to questions from all of you. I wanted to make sure there were some additional questions that I had gotten that didn't quite fit in anywhere else. So should we request an IEP meeting to review our services now? The answer is yes. I think you can tell from this conversation that there are a lot of issues for the team. And I think that you and your child should know what the first day of school is going to look like, whether that's remote or whether it's in person or whether it's hybrid. I think you should understand what the expectations are for the delivery of IEP services. You can only get that understanding through an IEP meeting. Someone else asked me a really hard question, and it was, I don't have daycare. My employer won't work with me. My kid is in remote learning. What do I do? Um, I wish I had an answer for you. I know that a lot of parents are in this situation. I am not an employment lawyer, so I can't tell you what to do in terms of whether or not you're entitled to leave from your job. I do know that the Cuyahoga County Bar Association, the Cuyahoga Metropolitan Bar Association, is trying to put together resources for parents that are in this situation to deal with that from an employment perspective. Some school districts are actually putting together child care plans, so even if they're running a remote learning program, they are working with area child care providers to help to provide some of that support. But unfortunately, from a school perspective, it's not going to be the responsibility of the school district to provide that. So I'm sorry. I know parents everywhere are really struggling with what to do. Where do I look for more information? Again, the links that we went through, the Ohio Department of Education, Reset and Restart, will include links to the general guide as well as all of the specialty guides, including preschool and students with disabilities. And then I just addressed the waiver situation here again, in case I forgot to address it earlier in the presentation. It's a concerning thing, and I am concerned that parents are being asked to sign waivers. And so again, I would encourage parents in that situation to really consider contacting an attorney and having a consultation to figure out whether or not that's really the best option for you and your child. Let's see. All right. One last question that I had that I didn't know how to answer easily or quickly, and it's, I've tried to be collaborative and work with my team. I've tried to request some in-person services. I really don't feel like the team is responding to me, and my child isn't receiving FAPE. What should I do? I think you've got a couple of options. Number one, reach out to your special ed coordinator or your district people services director. If that person has not already been a part of your team meetings and decision making or guidance that person can provide to you. Consider seeking the advice or support of an advocate or an attorney. There are private advocates and private attorneys that will work with families to try to get through these kinds of issues. There are also resources available through the Ohio Coalition for the Education of Children with Disabilities. That's OCECD. And if you just Google OCECD, you'll actually get them. So again, that's the Ohio Coalition for the Education of Children with Disabilities. The Autism Society of Greater Akron has a lot of support for parents that are trying to be good advocates. Parent support groups can be helpful. And then ultimately, you can consider filing a request for mediation. You can ask your district if they'll enter into mediation with you, or you consider filing a complaint or a due process request if you truly feel like the district is unresponsive to you and your child's needs. And so people had asked me what they could do. I wanted to make sure to answer that question. Those are really difficult decisions to make, and one that I would encourage you to try to get some support or guidance from a professional before you make that decision. Okay, so I think that there are probably additional questions. I'm going to stop the screen share so that I can look at the so that I can look at the chat box and open that up, Lisa, while you ask questions.
Sure. I want everyone to know that yes, you will get a copy of the slides, and I will post a copy of the recorded webinar. I actually send a link, an email directly to you since you have been a participant, so you'll get that in your email. Hopefully sometime tomorrow. Sometimes it takes a little longer to get done, but you will get that, as well as Kerry's contact information in case you need to ask something more specific that she wasn't able to get to tonight. I'm not sure, but I do think that you addressed a lot of the remote learning, how to advocate for in-person and things like that. If we didn't cover that, please let us know. Again, But I do see that somebody has a granddaughter changing schools, going to a parochial school. Her IEP is staying the same. Should she request an IEP meeting anyway?
I think only if you feel like one is necessary. You know, if you're switching schools and you feel like the school that you're going to has a good handle, particularly if you're going to a private school, if you feel like they have a good handle on the services and they're going to be providing in-person services, then I don't think you need to really worry about an IEP meeting. If you're going to a provider that's a private provider and you're on a scholarship program, so if you're accessing the Autism or John Peterson Scholarship, your service provider can do a service delivery change form with you. So if there are little tweaks that you think you need to the IEP, you can work with your scholarship provider to make those changes and not necessarily convene an entire IEP team.
So as a parent of, I have twin boys that are 18. They are seniors this year. So I'm going through this whole gamut myself too. I every year actually schedule a team meeting, usually about the first or second week in October, just so we can sit down and as a team figure out, are we on track? Is there anything? So I would encourage parents to do that, to go ahead and schedule, especially if you're in a new school or you're in a new grade, that you're not familiar with the teachers and things and how things are going to go. So I would encourage you to go ahead and get one on the books. And that way you can have it there and ready to go, and evaluate as you go along. So
Yeah, a lot easier to cancel a meeting that you don't need than it is to get one on the books when everybody gets busy.
it is. And at the same time, I would really encourage parents too. I know with my son, I have seen some interesting positive things come out of remote learning since we shut down. I've also seen some new behaviors that I wasn't anticipating. And so I think really trying to communicate some of that information up front to your team is really going to be beneficial to you as well. I actually put together a one-page profile on my son every year, and I give it to all of his teachers, and we sit down as a team and kind of talk that through. So I would encourage that as well. One question here, does IDEA have specific time frames for when an IEP team should be convened once a parent requests it? And
Not a specific time frame, no. The time frame is reasonable, and they're probably going to get a little bit of latitude with kind of all the craziness of COVID going on right now. That said, however, you really are entitled to kind of know what's supposed to happen with your child. So if you're seeing that they're trying to push this, you know, the first week of school, I think that's fine. If they're going 2, 3, 4 weeks later and not giving you a meeting, then I think that that's something that you may want to push. And ultimately, if you feel like it's denying you your opportunity to be a member of the team, you may want to consider filing a complaint with the Ohio Department of Education for failure to convene a team meeting in a timely manner.
I think I'd also encourage, I know this is a time, but I would encourage documentation too, because that way you have how many times, and I think we can all look at something and determine when something becomes unreasonable. So
Yeah,
I think, like we said, we all kind of did what we needed to do when we shut down, and everyone's been very patient, but it is a new ball game now, and the game is on, and we have higher expectations and things need to happen differently.
agreed.
um, if there is an online school that works better with our kiddos with autism? um,
So I have a policy and practice as a part of my law firm that we do not make recommendations for specific schools. I can tell you that there are schools that are great for some kids and just not great for others. And so much of it depends on your child's learning profile that I couldn't answer that question without knowing a lot more about your child.
So we have an options policy as well at the Autism Society where we can, if you'd like, you can call our office and speak to Wendy. She is our support specialist. So she can give you a list of schools. What we provide as well is a checklist. So when you're going outside of the public school district and you're considering your free and appropriate public education, there are lots of questions that you may not think about. And so we have a checklist as well that can help you determine if the philosophy of the school and the way that they handle certain circumstances is conducive to your family environment and your family's best needs. So feel free to call the office, and we're happy to help you work through that as well. And for
One thing I
anything,
would say, I was just going to say, one thing I would say is that there are a lot of private schools that don't normally offer online services that are this year. So if there's a particular private school that you feel like does a good job with kids with autism, and you want to reach out to them to see if they are offering an online option for this school year, there are a lot of them that are. So it opens the door, I think, a little bit more than what you would normally see in terms of online.
very good. Well, I think that looks like we've answered most of them here. Kerry, thank you again so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
We do have, I'll also include in the email to everybody the links to the prior sessions so that you can go back and review. Good information in all of it. There's some other webinars out there that we've done as well that can kind of give you a little bit more support as far as handling anxiety of our kiddos when they go back to school, and our own anxiety. So I encourage you to look at the rest of the webinars as well. So you all are very welcome. Thank you for your patience and for attending tonight. And please reach out and tell us if you're struggling, especially myself. Tell me if you're struggling with something, and if there is a professional that we can get to try and help work through some of these challenges, we're happy to do that. That's what we're here for. So we wish everyone well. We'll be in touch. Stay safe, and let us know if there's anything we can do for you. And thank you again, Kerry. I think you froze on me.
Oh, thank you. And thanks, everybody. Too
All
much
right.
presentation.
Talk to you later. Have a good one.
Bye, everybody.